So from your notes from yesterday, we did not get to finish the notes. You have one problem that we did not get to, one example. That example gives you these two triangles here that are connected, tells you that R is the midpoint of PT and QS, and asks you to prove that the segments PQ and ST are congruent. 13 asks you to prove the triangle's congruent. That actually is one step less than this right here. This right here is talking about if I have congruent triangles, if I know that PRQ and SRT are congruent, then I can say that PQ is congruent to ST by corresponding parts of congruent triangles, or congruent, that CPCTC thing. Okay, if we have congruent triangles. The problem is that we have to get to congruent triangles, which is what 13 is asking you to do from your homework assignment last night. Okay, so the example in your notes is actually one step longer than number 13 will be. Was that your question?
I don't remember my question.
I thought maybe it was about number 13 being different.
It was. I
Okay.
forgot what I was going to ask them.
Okay, number 13 is just one step less than what we are going to do in the notes. Okay, so this is going to do number 13 as well as the example from your notes right now. So, we need a statements and reasons column. Here we go. Statements and reasons. Let's talk about what statements and reasons make sense. We always, always, always start out with what we're given. So we are given that R is the midpoint of PT. And I'm going to break my own rule. Usually I split the two givens up into two different steps, but for the amount of writing's sake, I'm going to combine them into the first step. All right, ladies? So PT and QS are both midpointed by R. What does it mean to be a midpoint? The definition of the midpoint might help me here. What does either the midpoint, what do you know about a midpoint? Just tell me what you know. Yeah.
In the middle of two.
What does it mean to be in the middle? Mathematically, give me some kind of like
Equal on both sides.
equal on both sides. Can we even jump to congruent on both sides?
Yes.
That's pretty important. Okay, so let's put the definition of a midpoint as our reason for being able to say that the long segments that have a midpoint of R are bisected, which means cut into two congruent or equal parts. Okay, they are bisected by R. So we're going to say that PR is congruent to RT or TR. Let's go TR. Okay? Those two are congruent by the definition of a midpoint. We can also say that QR and SR are congruent by the definition of a midpoint. That's a very, very crucial step because that gives us PR and TR are two sides in the triangles that are congruent. So that's a side right there. And QR and SR are two other sides in the two triangles, and they are congruent. Now we either need, from what we talked about yesterday, a third side or the angle between the two sides that we know are congruent to be congruent, and then we know we have congruent triangles from what we talked about yesterday. Okay, so can I get either the third side or the angle between them to be congruent. Well, the third side is PQ and ST, and I'm trying to prove those are congruent, so I don't really think I can jump to them being congruent just yet. There's nothing that tells me PQ and ST are congruent. I would have to be pretty much told that. I might have to be told that, like, yeah, I would pretty much have to be told that, because they're not connected in any way. Austin?
The two angles of mean,
You mean these right here? How do you know? Let's name that angle first of all. Angle PRQ is congruent to angle TRS. Notice I was very strategic in the way I named those angles. P is similar to T because they're both at the end of the segment that is congruent to itself. Okay? So P and T should be named in the same order in the angle, technically speaking. All right? So PRQ would be congruent to TRS. Okay? What's the reason for that? How do you know that this angle is congruent to that angle? Because they're vertical angles. Excellent. Did anybody see that? Vertical angles are always congruent. That's the definition of vertical angles. Okay? Now that we have two sides and an angle between them, I very plainly have marked the angle and the two sides that angle is between. I've marked that on your proof. Remember, I did that yesterday with you as well. I really think that's going to help you because there are only 5 ways to prove triangles are congruent. One of them is very significant to right triangles. We're going to talk about the other 2 ways to prove any triangles are congruent today. So far, all you know is side, 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 and side, angle, side. If you can't get to one of those 2 things, you can't prove the triangles are congruent. So that's a big deal. Okay? It's very narrow as to what your options are to prove triangles are congruent right now. So we can now say, because we have side and we have 2 sides and an angle between them that are congruent, we can say that triangle PQR is congruent to, triangle PQR would be congruent to triangle TSR. And if you wanted to keep it in a different order, that'd be fine. However, you have to keep the things that are corresponding parts in the same positions in your names of your triangles. All right? The reason is what? Why can we say that those triangles are congruent? I've danced around it and maybe even all over it already this period, in the last couple minutes. Why are those 2 triangles congruent? What's your reason?
side angle side.
Pretty blatantly on the board, isn't it?
Yep.
Side, angle, side. Very good. Side, angle, side congruence. Now, I'm going to be detailed. I didn't emphasize this with you enough yesterday. I know I didn't. You need to put congruence after that. And the reason is because we're going to have similarity, which is something different, and the reasons won't be very different. Okay? Like the titles won't be much different. So you need to put congruence after that. We're not done, but we're really close. We now have the triangles are congruent. That's what 13 asks you to prove. So for 13, you would be done after step 4. For the example in your notes, you're asked to prove PQ is congruent to ST. Well, PQ and ST, look at that. They are similar parts in the same triangle. They're corresponding parts in our now congruent triangles. We've now proven the triangles are congruent. The corresponding parts have to be congruent. Okay, so we can say that PQ is congruent to ST. By what reason? Anybody? Again, I just danced around it and maybe even all over it about 2 seconds ago.
Okay.
Why are PQ and ST congruent?
Side angle, side congruent.
That's why the triangles are congruent.
Side, side, side.
The side would prove would prove other triangles are congruent. I think you might be seeing that this is a third side in the two triangles. Maybe that's why you pointed it out. But those are reasons to prove the triangles are congruent.
If R and R is congruent.
So you're trying to use the subtraction property or something like that, yes? Maybe, but these are not added or multiplied or anything like that. If you know that these two triangles are congruent, how do you know that any of the sides in them are congruent?
They all have to add if you want to.
That's the angles. That's the angles, and that would tell you that if two pairs of the angles are congruent, then the third side of the angles, the third pair of angles has to be congruent. This is what CPCTC tells you. It tells you that once you have triangles that are congruent, any of their parts that correspond are congruent to each other. So we have congruent triangles. We can say that PQ is congruent to ST because corresponding parts, they are corresponding parts. They're in the same positions in the two triangles. Corresponding parts in congruent triangles have to be congruent. They have to. Excuse me. CPCTC is oftentimes going to take you from congruent triangles to pieces of the triangle that are congruent. Okay, so we've now finished yesterday's notes. And we did number 13 at the same time. We're going to go on to today's stuff, which is section 4.5. You do have a worksheet. That worksheet will encompass all of yesterday's and today's material. Okay? It's two-sided.
We're not turning this in.
You will turn it in maybe by the end of the day. How about on the file, on that little chest of drawers over there on your way out? Does that work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So,